Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadali Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tad Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpa Trubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. My Dandavat Pranam devotees. I am trying to do a very short video here, especially since I've done videos on this topic before, some pretty impassioned videos on this topic. My Dandavat Pranam, Sadan Siddha Prabhu. But I had a lot of questions come into my inbox and some emails about this particular perennial issue of the Jiva and the Jiva's fall or not falling from the spiritual world. Over the last maybe month or so, I've also heard several classes where the issue has come up. In part, at least the classes that I've heard that I listen to locally here, is because we're just in the section of Srimad Bhagavatam where it deals with the descent of Jai and Vijay for the purpose of having Leela with Bhagavan. So, anyways, based on that particular part of Srimad Bhagavatam, as well as just in other places, somehow the issue just has a way of every year rising up for discussion. So I want to here not so much go into details. As I've mentioned, I've done question and answer sessions on this before, but two things. I did not want the devotees who were writing to feel that I was neglecting answering because I've been very busy and I was traveling and I still am pretty much absorbed in some services. There's also Chaturmas, so of course bhajan life is more intensified during this time. So my time is a little different in order to do these questions and answers on a regular basis. But what I will do today is set the framework for discussion on this particular issue that would be a fruitful or viable discussion. The first thing probably that has to be recognized is that certainly in many interviews, in many question and answer sessions with devotees, in some purports of Srila Prabhupada's writing, Srila Prabhupada has couched language that certainly appears to indicate that we had fallen from the spiritual world. I don't know if I've ever seen a direct statement saying, yes, the Jiva fell from the spiritual world, but there are many certainly especially devotee questions and answers with Srila Prabhupada and interviews where Srila Prabhupada has couched the language that, yes, due to misuse of free will, you have fallen away from Krishna, and now by the practice of bhakti, you can reestablish your relationship with Krishna. So, but of course, anybody who's read Srila Prabhupada's books fully, and even if you have not read Srila Prabhupada's books fully, you certainly have come across the statements in Srila Prabhupada's books in many places declaring the impossibility of falling from the spiritual world. Of course, in the 7th canto, especially chapter 1, text 34 and 35, especially in text 35 is the famous quote where he's discussing the descent of Jai and Vijay, mentions that unless there's to be something done on behalf of the Lord, it is a fact that no one falls from Vaikuntha. So the first thing that has to be established in any discussion on this issue is that you have two statements by the person whom we are mutually accepting as authority. Anytime there's any kind of debate in the Vedic system, there has to be a mutual acceptance of praman. In other words, what praman or evidences we'll accept, which we won't. The vetting system, which has been given by our Srila Prabhupada as well as our entire Guru Parampara, is Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. So for convenience sake, we can all mutually accept Srila Prabhupada in the position of Guru. Certainly, we can accept that our Guru Parampara are all sadhus. So if you want to perhaps create an environment of discussion where we sort of pinpoint which among those sadhus will accept, certainly our Goswami Varga will stand out heads and tails. That what our Goswami Varga has written on any subject matter, in particularly Jiva Goswami, who was sort of commissioned with creating the philosophical wall around the theology of Mahaprabhu as he gave it to Rupa Goswami and others, is key. So we can mutually accept certainly that that's all Praman. But of course, the front face of any Praman for us will be Srila Prabhupada's writings, as we're accepting that the mutual authority of Guru is Srila Prabhupada. Right? It does not mean that one's own Guru is not evidence or Praman for them. Certainly it should be. But when you're having a discussion among multiple persons who may have different Gurus, then you have to establish a person who you establish as the principle of Guru for that discussion. Then, as I mentioned, sadhus, and certainly sastra. So, it is clear that Srila Prabhupada has mentioned clearly in his writings, and I will put in the commentary here, the evidence is not only of Srila Prabhupada, but of all of our sadhus and sastra and everything, for anyone's edification if they want to look these things up. But the point being here, we have to first accept there are two statements made. The fact that there are two statements made and these statements apparently contradict each other, the key thing here will be reconciliation of the statements and how they work together. Srila Prabhupada certainly cannot be wrong. Srila Prabhupada cannot be confused. Srila Prabhupada certainly cannot simply be presenting contradictory statements. So there is a reconciliation to both sides of the statements that Srila Prabhupada is giving. But in order to have a fruitful discussion, we have to be willing to accept that there is not a necessity to be institutionally favorable to Srila Prabhupada's movement, that you have to accept an idea that we did fall from the spiritual world. And right now, the institutional dynamic, what seems to be, by many classes I'm hearing from very senior devotees, the institutional framework of trying to institutionalize that understanding is cracking. So either by the fact that many of the senior members of society, perhaps having read more, having obviously come into maturation in 40, 50 years of practice, have realized that, it's certainly stated by Srila Prabhupada and Acharyas that we do not fall. So now they are put into a position when having to answer questions about this, or when it comes up in the natural course of giving a Srimad Bhagavatam class, like for instance, due to the fact that where we are in Bhagavatam here in Alachua, then they have to deal with that subject. So naturally, at a certain point, their own understanding of that will come out, and many are just outright saying, no, we did not fall from the spiritual world. So now, still there is a sort of cloud of the original institutional imposition of the understanding that we did fall from the spiritual world lingering in the social fabric. So how we deal comfortably and maturely with having a discussion around that is to first get both parties who are discussing it to accept there are two statements. And a favoring of one statement over the other won't really reconcile things, but rather it will create division on the basis of the fact that there are two statements made by the same person. Which obviously that doesn't seem to make sense, but in a world where things don't always make sense, what can you do? So, here, by acknowledging that both statements were made by our Srila Prabhupada, we can try to now reconcile. So again, the method of reconciliation and the method of vetting anything as a Siddhanta is always done through Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra. So we have Guru. Guru has made both statements. Because remember, we've accepted Srila Prabhupada mutually as in the position of Guru for the sake of this discussion. What has Sastra said about this? So again, I will put in the commentary all kinds of Sastra Praman, all the way back to our Goswami Vargas, especially inclusive of Srila Prabhupada's statements on this particular issue, as well as the Sastric statements. Like in Srimad Bhagavatam 7.1, 34 and 35, statements in Chaitanya Charitamrita regarding the Anadi Kal association of the Jiva with Avidya, Srimad Bhagavatam statement in 11th canto, chapter 22, verse 10, Anadi Avidya Yuktasha. Similarly in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 13, text number 20. So in this way, there are several sastric statements speaking to the Anadi Kal association of the Jivas with the Avidya Shakti. Now, there are some things which obviously have to be flushed out to make it clear why these statements of Sastra are indicative of not falling. But unless we set the framework for that, then it could come up that, no, well, still, you have two statements and we're leaning into one, someone else is leaning into another. So let's flush it out a little bit to try to understand. One is that the statements which speak about Anadi, we have to define clearly this word Anadi. Our Srila Prabhupada used a term in describing many Sanskrit words which were perhaps difficult to digest in our English parlance by using words which he felt would be more easily digestible. So Anadi in particular is a interesting term, and our Jiva Goswami Pad, again we're using that Praman, in the Tattva Sandarbha has quoted 4 terms and given definitions for them. So he mentions that the word Anadi means something that has no beginning. Literally in Sanskrit the word means Anadi, no beginning. Then he describes what is called Ananta. So Ananta means something that has no anta, means end. Then he describes something which is Nitya. It means it has no beginning and no end. Then he also described Anicca, which means something that really has no existence. So the word Anadi, in its actual original sastric usage, meant something that has no beginning, but it does have an end. Whereas the word Ananta means something that has a beginning but has no end. So, if we're going to take the word as it was originally used, right, understanding that Srila Prabhupada was not incorrect in couching it in a way that we could understand it, which is time immemorial, right, or time immemorable, then we can work. So if we accept it as the actual definition, something that has no beginning but does have an end, this would be an adequate explanation of how part of Krishna's Jiva Shakti can be affiliated with the Avidya Shakti, means the material energy, from time without any beginning. You understand? So, if that is the case, then obviously we didn't have a genesis in the spiritual world and then at some point fell to the spiritual world. Now, I've heard several ways to try to explain Anadi in other ways, like, well, it's beyond time. Well, the fall that happened, but it wasn't in time, etc., etc. But then there are many other theological issues that would arise. I've mentioned them in other videos, so I don't want to try to elaborate here. I'll just briefly describe some. One is that the very nature of the spiritual world itself has been described in the first verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, Damna Swena Sada Nirastam Kuhakam, that it is ever free from any kind of illusion. So if the jivas that are existing in the Vaikuntha or the spiritual realm as a whole, Golok, Vrindavan, etc., if they're living in an environment in which no illusion is possible, what would be the genesis or impetus of a Mayic Avadan? Mayic Avadan means a covering of some kind of Maya that would obfuscate the reality of the loving relationship established with Krishna, which also has been written in Shastra as Savata Donksa Rahitam Yarapi Donksa Karane, which can never be broken. Not the constitutional relationship of being Das of Krishna, The prem itself, Sakya prem, Vatsalya prem, Madhurya rasa prem, that prem cannot be broken under any circumstance. Dasyaras prem cannot be broken under any circumstance. So it's not talking about the constitutional relationship. Certainly that's not broken, but it's saying that the prem cannot be broken. This is one of the definitions Rupa Goswami is giving in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu of prem itself. So he's describing what is prem, and he's giving this definition. Savata dongsa rahitam yat api dongsa karane. There is no karan or cause which can cause love to break. So one, no illusory potency can enter the spiritual realm where the jivas are dwelling, if we're going to go with the fall philosophy. One. Secondly, there is no breaking of the prem. Third thing would be the nature of the ladini vritti. So the Swarup Shakti, or the internal energy of God, has three features. Samvit means the cognitive potency that allows us to realize who is Krishna, who are we, and what is our relationship, not only constitutionally, but in the realm of prem. The ladini vritti, or ladini vritti, is the pleasure potency garnered from that realization. There is no potency of pleasure that could supersede that pleasure, cause the jiva to have an alternative thought of finding pleasure somewhere else. In other words, the nature of the pleasure of serving Krishna is itself full. So for this reason, Shastra also says, once having obtained that abode, one never again returns. So now we'll get to Srila Prabhupada's statements that I made earlier about devotees asking that question and saying, yes, if you misuse your free will, again you will return. So Srila Prabhupada has also mentioned in his books many times that the devotees who are eternally associates of the Lord, those devotees who obtain the Lord's abode, are protected by this internal potency of Bhagavan, in which there's no possibility of an alternative misuse of free will arising. Then why would Srila Prabhupada say to devotees that if you will misuse your free will, you can fall again? There are a number of considerations here. One is that the entire Acharya Leela of our Srila Prabhupada was 11 years and change. Devotees now are in their 50th year, 40th year of practice. I came to the path of bhakti in 1972. I started associating on Henry Street. I maintained a consistent association, though I went back to school and so many different things. I maintained reading the books, going to the temples, etc. And then, of course, returning in 1979, I had an unbroken relationship with Srila Prabhupada, his teachings, everything ongoing from that time. So now you're looking at 40 or 50 years of practice. You understand? And many devotees are in that category of 35, 40, 50 years of practice. So certainly we have to acknowledge that in a span of association with Srila Prabhupada, in an 11-year period, where our level of maturation for understanding many things may have been at that time. So if Srila Prabhupada is speaking to a devotee, it very well could be for the edification of that devotee never to become too proud to think, I'm impervious to being affected by Maya. That once having attained a certain position, I'm impervious. So that's a lesson. That is a teaching from Guru to always remain Trinadapi Sunich. You understand? So that is completely rational, since we have the innumerable statements of Srila Prabhupada saying, and of Shastra, and of Sadhu declaring the infallibility of the residents of the spiritual world. Right? Doimo Purusho Loke, Kshara Akshara Evacha. Even in Bhagavad Gita, it's describing those living entities who are infallible and who are fallible. So infallibility is a reality in the spiritual world. Therefore, there is no mechanism or there is no facility to cause a fall from an association with Krishna in the spiritual world into the Avidya Shakti. So now the stock answer for why we could fall is that we have minute free will. So now we have to again theologically put that on the scale. Though we have minute free will, is that free will anywhere mentioned by Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra having the capability of violating the very nature of the spiritual world. So in other words, though we have minute free will, does it mean that because of our minute free will, illusion can enter into the spiritual arena? Does it mean that Maya can infiltrate the relationship with Krishna in the spiritual world, in a particular rasa with Krishna, so that we can have that relationship broken, though Jiva Goswami Sastra is mentioning it's unbroken or cannot be broken, but our free will is more powerful than the spiritual domain itself and Krishna's own design of the spiritual world, in which there is no illusion, etc. So we have to really put that on the scale. Is that possible? And if we're saying that it is possible, why would not the converse be possible? In other words, being in the material world, we have to go through samsara, lifetimes of birth, old age, disease, and death. Why is it that our free will does not have the potency that in the inferior energy of God, we can't exercise our will to simply stop those things instantly? So I'm giving a minute to ponder that statement. The free will is powerful enough to override the laws of the spiritual world, but not the material world, in which the energy is inferior to that of the spiritual world. So therefore, Sastra is always accompanied by yukti. So Sastra yukti sunipuna, right? Those who are adept, sunipuna, in Sastra and Sastra yukti, the logic of Sastra. You understand? So it can't be that Sastra becomes illogical, that my independent free will is powerful enough to usurp the very laws of the spiritual domain, but the same thing is conversely not true, being in the inferior energy of Bhagavan. What about Sastra Praman for what I'm saying? Again, in the verse of the 11th canto, 22:10, Anadi avidya yuktasha purushasya vedatmanam swato na sambhavanti. The jivas who are caught from anadi kala and avidya cannot extricate themselves. Anya, it requires another person. Gyanatva ganado bhavet. Gyanatva means that sadhu who is realized soul, who has the compassion, gyanadva ganado bhavet, to give you that cognition, that spiritual transcendental knowledge. So da means to give. And gyanatva means they have that transcendental knowledge. So this is the only means of extrication from the inferior energy of Bhagavan. You understand? So if that is the case, we can't even extricate ourselves from the inferior Shakti of Bhagavan. How does our free will have the potency to usurp the very laws of the spiritual domain? That's just not logical. So now we could use cover words like it's achintya, it's inconceivable, but we also don't have Sastra Praman. So it brings me to my next point, that in the 11,519 verses of Chaitanya Charitamrita, the 18,000 verses, 335 chapters, 100 stories of Srimad Bhagavatam, we only have indication of a fall in one allegorical story told by Narada Muni to Maharaj Prachinabhari. If the jivas in fact fall from the spiritual world, this would be a crux part of the Siddhantic reality that certainly would have been covered in our Mool Granth, means our root scripture, Srimad Bhagavatam. If not, certainly would have been covered in Chaitanya Charitamrita, in which Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami had garnered all the theological conceptions coming from Mahaprabhu to Swarup Damodar to Raghunath Das Goswami to himself at the bank of Radhakund. He certainly would have included that in Chaitanya Charitamrita. But rather, he's also written in Chaitanya Charitamrita that we're anadi bahiramukh. That our being bahirmukh, or turned towards the material energy, is anadi. So back to the definition of anadi, something that has no beginning. Now, what of the situation with our Srila Prabhupada speaking these things in the first place? So we have to go back now. So I've given evidences in logic and sastra and sadhu for the idea of not falling, but still we have to accommodate that Srila Prabhupada did make the statement. And he couched language that would be indicative that we fell from the spiritual world. How do we deal with that? It is in Sastra that the acharyas, and sometimes Sastra itself, speaks in four ways: narrative, history, ontology, Siddhanta. In Siddhanta, there are two divisions: Tattva Siddhanta and Rasa Siddhanta. So let me give an example as best I can of each of those. So Narada Muni is an example right now in the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, speaking a history. What is he speaking a history of? The particular descent of Jai and Vijay in three births in order to give Viras pleasure to Bhagavan in three different incarnations. So he's telling the backstory and history of that Leela. So that's an actual history. To Maharaj Prachinabhari, Narada Muni also told a narrative. What was the narrative? That there was a person named Puranjan. Is that a history? No. It is a narrative. It's an allegorical story. That's not a real history. It's an allegorical story to elucidate a point about the soul and the practice of bhakti to Maharaj Prachinabhari. So we know Sastra and sadhus like Narada Muni affirm the use of narratives is actually fine in pursuit of understanding bhakti. Then ontology. So an ontological description may be given in describing the incarnations of Krishna. That Balaram is the first expansion of Krishna as the Vaibhav Prakash. From him comes Mool, Shankar, Shan, then a Chaturvyuha, etc. So there's not a historical context to Baladev expanding from Krishna. So this description is called ontology, or it's an ontological presentation of how the incarnations of Bhagavan exist and how the system works. And it's giving an indication that Krishna is the root of all the incarnations. So it's an ontological presentation, right? It's not a historical one. There wasn't a time in history that Baladev separated from Krishna, etc., etc. Just like in the case of Srimati Radharani, is described in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Radha Krishna Sada Achayi Eki Sarup, Leela Rasa Asudate Dari Duri Rup. Radha and Krishna are one Sarup, but they have eternally separated into two forms to taste Leela Rasa, right? So there's no history to this. Again, it's an ontological presentation, right? Next, you have actual, so we did narratives, history, ontology. You have Siddhanta. Siddhanta can be in two forms, Tattva Siddhanta and Rasa Siddhanta. So I'm giving an example of both. In Tattva Siddhanta, the statement in Srimad Bhagavatam is there. Krishna Stu Bhagavan Swayam. Krishna Swayam Bhagavan. In Brahma Samhita, Krishna is Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchidananda Vigraha Anadiradiya Govinda Sava Karana Karanam. Krishna has no beginning, no end. Krishna is Ishvara Parama. He is the Ishvara among all other Ishvaras or controllers. And Sava Karana Karanam. He is the cause of all causes. Understand? So he is Bhagavan based on all of these things. You understand? So that is a Siddhantic statement. At the same time, it's explained, Namayishwaram Sachirananda Rupam Jashorabiyo Lukala Dhavamanam. This is the line I'm looking for. So that person who is Satyavrat Muni's offering first his obeisances, Namayishwaram Sachirananda Rupam, that same Ishvara, he's running away from Mother Yashoda. The real problem is that not only is he running, but he can't outrun Mother Yashoda. He's caught from behind. Yashoda Biyokalat, and he's full of fear. And ultimately, not only is he caught from behind by Mother Yashoda, Bhagavan, who has to have all opulences. Speed I would consider an opulence, but he can't outrun Mother Yashoda. And then he's bound. He's unlimited. He showed in his own mouth the unlimited nature of his Bhagavat Sarup. But still he was bound by Mother Yashoda with ropes. Therefore, in Rasa Gata Vichar, though he's Bhagavan, his Bhagavata, his supreme nature, is controlled by praying. Right? What is this shlok? Also in Damodarashtakam. Iti Drikshwalila Virananda Kunde Swagosham nimanjantam ayam payantam tariyeshita geshur bhaktar chitatvam. Though he's Bhagavan, then by their praying, the inhabitants of Gokul have been drowned in the ecstasy, Ladini Vritti of that praying. However possible, they'll leave that place. They're drowned in the ecstasy of praying for this Krishna. And because of that, they're able to bring Krishna under their control. So Bhagavan is Ajita. He can't be controlled by anyone. But here it's saying he's Jita. So Jiva Goswami is given very nice explanation about this. He's mentioned Bhagavat Stavat Asadharana Sarup Aishwarya Madhurya Tattva Visesh. One of the features that makes Krishna the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Swayam Bhagavan, is that in his Swarup, he's reconciled Aishwarya, means his Bhagavata, and his Madhuryata, means the sweetness of how he succumbs to prema of his devotees. You understand? So, we've discussed narrative, history, ontology, and Siddhanta, both Rasa Siddhanta and Tattva Siddhanta. So the Sastras and the Acharyas speak in these four ways. So now my point here is that, would it have been inconsistent or wrong for Srila Prabhupada to speak in a narrative for those coming into the path of bhakti, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if you were with Srila Prabhupada from the very beginning, 11 years, in helping to understand what is the nature of Jiva Tattva, to couch it in something that we were familiar with. Whether you were Christian or not, in the Western world, the dominance of Christian theology was present. So the idea of a fall from grace, repentance, and a return to grace is a theological conception that was built into the Western world, whether you're actually Christian or not. You understand? So the idea of a fall, repentance, and then reestablishment in grace or in a relationship to God was a theological conception that was fully present in the Western world. To couch the narrative of Siddhantic conceptions like anadikal, bondage, understanding that these, how easily would that have been to digest, especially since we all were coming to the process with so much material impression about what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is unjust. If Srila Prabhupada had laid out these kind of spiritual Siddhantic facts at a time when people saw justice according to their material vision and still do to this day, they would have simply thought that Krishna is very unjust. How could he put us in a position where we are, quote, suffering from anadikal, time without any beginning? Of course, that bars the fact that we're not understanding that the jivas are actually not directly connected to the material energy and they're suffering as a vicarious experience, etc., etc. Right? That also doesn't mean they're in the spiritual world. Jiva Goswami and Paramatma Sandarbhi is mentioned, Ekrup Sarupa Bhav. They remain situated in their nature. But Jiva Goswami also says, Anadi Paramatattva Jnanam Samsarga Abhav. The word abhav means an absence. And if you study this verse carefully, it's mentioning this is called prag abhav, means a prior absence of paratattva jnana, means samvit shakti, means the internal spiritual energy. So the jivas from anadikal have been void of swarup shakti. This is the reason they are susceptible to the influence of the avijja shakti. Now, for Srila Prabhupada to have bypassed all of those kind of explanations, having come to bhakti in a period of anywhere from 1 to 11 years, and Srila Prabhupada's concentrated mission on getting out the philosophy of Mahaprabhu and the chanting of Harinam and the establishment of living Krishna conscious life, would it have been wrong at all to simply give a resonant explanation, meaning here an explanation that resonated with what we had been familiar with? Would there have been a problem to that? Is it not Siddhantic? Narada Muni did it. And you can find hundreds in Sastra of narratives given by sadhus to elucidate a particular point of philosophy. So the statements are not inconsistent, or they're not inconsistent, nor are they actually contradictory. because it's a way to explain a Siddhanta that may not have been digestible, and even if it was digestible by those rare few high class of persons who were already highly developed in that 1 to 11 year period, right, that they would have understood all these things of Jiva Goswami, etc., that's one thing. But the mass amount of devotees who were coming to the process, that was not something that they would have garnered easily. What is a Nadi Kal bondage? Why is there a Nadi Kal bondage? What is the nature of even the term Anadi? Why is it that there's some jivas who have the benefit of living in the spiritual world and others who come here to a place that we're saying is full of misery, etc., etc.? So then social justice issues would arise. I'm always making the joke. People would have thought jivas' lives matter. Why are we suffering? So people would have wanted to boycott Vaikuntha. All kind of, I'm joking at this point, but I'm just giving the point where our understanding would not have inspired explanations of this length and detail regarding Jiva Tattva. In the same way, if you have a 5-year-old who inquires from you about where babies come from, and you told them that babies are a gift from God, it would neither be wrong, it would be absolutely true. At the same time, it would not be an explanation of the details of adult intimacy, etc., etc. But it would be digestible for that child at the time. Certainly when the child is 21 years old, he wouldn't approach his wife and say, let's pray. She says, why are we praying? We want to have a child. Well, why are we praying? Because all babies are a gift of God. So we'll bypass adult intimacy, etc. So I'm framing this to just give an understanding practically of how to understand the two statements. One was actually a statement meant, and some devotees rebel against this idea, which was resonant with our understanding. And many devotees who speak about that weren't even there at the time. They weren't even here during the time of Srila Prabhupada's Acharya Leela. But they've imbibed the institutional idea, and in part of a sort of materialistic identification with the institution, want to defend that situation, not based on a true understanding, but simply based on wanting to be part of a team that espouses this side of the argument. But as soon as you hear the fact that Srila Prabhupada has two statements, if you're being genuine, you immediately have to stop and say, oh, well, Srila Prabhupada said both things. So I've not been able to reconcile yet. So in my inability to reconcile, I will simply go on practicing bhakti sincerely. Because this issue is not an issue that is crux to developing love of God. Therefore, many times Srila Prabhupada said, what does it matter how you got here? Just work on getting out. Right? But if it was very, very important how we got here, in terms of that statement that we felt from the spiritual world, Srila Prabhupada would have given so much emphasis to it in his writings that it would be established clearly. No, this other philosophy that we did not follow is wrong. But he didn't do that. He in fact said himself in many cases, which I'm going to put in the commentary, or in the comments here, many times that we did not follow. In Krishna book, chapter 28, he mentions clearly there, once the devotees have obtained their perfection or maturation in bhakti, they will go to wherever Krishna is performing his leelas within the material universes, and there they will see Krishna face to face for the first time. So there's just so much evidence, right, regarding the actual Siddhanta conclusion, and it meets the vetting criterion of our Srila Prabhupada, vetting criteria, Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, and it lines up with all logic, right? So therefore, if you are unable to grasp it and you want to hold on to the idea that we did fall, it is not something that will block you from attaining pure bhakti. What will, however, cause a problem is if you then argue that point to the point of aparad or offense to another devotee. So then the aparad will be impactful on your bhakti. You understand? Or if you criticize other very senior Vaishnavas because they have accepted the statement of Srila Prabhupada that we do not fall, and they're also couching their understanding with the vetting process of Guru, Sadhu, and Sastra, and you become angry or frustrated or whatever it might be, and then you angrily criticize or lash out at them or ban them or various other things, right? Then the aparad will become a problem. So one way to harmoniously deal with the issue is if you don't understand clearly, you can't reconcile it, accept Srila Prabhupada made both statements. Don't take a side at all. If you've accepted that Srila Prabhupada says we do not fall, but you don't have the Sastra Praman and the backing, don't go and create an argument just on the basis Srila Prabhupada said we don't fall, you say he did fall, so let's have an argument. Because that's also a breeding ground for aparad, and that's not going to be helpful to bhakti. So hopefully, and let me just reiterate this one point before I conclude here, the very first thing that needs to be accepted in a fruitful and civilized discussion on this issue is that Srila Prabhupada made both statements. Going through what I just mentioned here on this video, which is much longer than I anticipated it to be, you can then look at everything and see why he said both statements. All right, my Dandavat Pranam devotees. If there's any further questions, you can put them in the comments. Again, I will post the Praman that I spoke about, not only from our Srila Prabhupada, but all of our previous acharyas as well. I will put that in the comment section so devotees can look them up. And similarly, if anybody can find any verse, not a purport, not a saying, not a letter, but any actual sastric verse that says that we fell from the spiritual world, besides the allegorical story to Maharaj Prachinabhari or any other allegorical story, if you can find an actual verse stating that, please put it also in the comment. Again, not a purport, not a letter, not a statement from a lecture, right? Because again, those things may have been used for a certain purpose. But what is in Sastra is in Sastra permanently, for all time, all circumstances, all places. All right, my Dandavat Pranam. Vancha Kalpatrivishya, Kripa Sindhuvevacha, Patitanam Pavanevya Vaishnavevya Namo Namaha. Jai Hare Krishna.